Hi, I'm Marcia Waldman. I guess, thank you. Really, thank you for coming out on such a rainy, gloomy night. I'm so happy to see so many good friends here. So what's your story? This is our second performance of What's Your Story? The first was pre-COVID. And stories are as old as human beings. I think the first stories might have been about taking down that antelope or finding a fresh source of water. They were about survival. They came to be about entertainment, about religion, about theater, and Twitter. The Moth revived the fine art of storytelling 25 years ago. The format is true personal stories told before an audience without notes. But they're stories that make a difference. When we share our stories, we share ourselves. We create bonds, empathy, compassion, community, understanding through our stories. Tonight, 8 of us will share our stories and ourselves on the theme of journey. So some of the stories are about voyages, and some are about getting from one place in our lives to another, and some about both. The first story is by Bruce Connors, and many of us know him because he's a regular volunteer here. Bruce has lived in the Valley for 40 years. He is a cinematography, a film and video producer. And he and his wife raised their family in an 18th century home here in the Valley. So Bruce has a voyage on which he learned some very useful lessons. So please welcome Bruce Connors.
Good evening. We're going to call this Peekskill to Bermuda. It began at my 30th high school reunion, where I was reacquainted with my friend and classmate, Jay Brennan. In the interim, Jay had lost both his legs, married a beautiful woman, and became an expert blue water sailor. During the course of the evening, he told me that him and some of his buddies were sailing to Bermuda in the late spring, and he invited me to join them. Well, I'd sailed on the Long Island Sound and on Lake George, and I said, sure, I'm a sailor, I'd love to go. So I joined the crew of a 38-foot ketch called Noah's Ark. Now, the crew got together for a meeting at Conley's, which is now the Birdsall House in Peekskill, to get to know each other. So we had 2 expert sailors. We had Jay Brennan, and we had Ralph, a former Navy officer and a dentist, so he was our health officer on this trip. Then we had Noah, who owned the yacht. Noah was a left-wing accountant who had Abby Hoffman as a client. And then we had Marty, who was a journalist who wrote for union publications, and Marty had never sailed before. So on our day of departure, Noah's Ark was all loaded with water, food, and diesel fuel, and we had extra diesel fuel stored in 5-gallon plastic tanks that we put in the lazarette, which is a storage space in the stern of the boat underneath the seats. And we foamed that in so it wouldn't rattle about and make a mess in rough seas. So we leave Peekskill and we sail under the Tappan Zee Bridge, under the George Washington Bridge. As we enter New York Harbor, we pop open a bottle of champagne and toast the majestic lady in the harbor. It's then under the Verrazano and out to Ambrose Light, where we set our rum line south-southeast straight to Bermuda. Now, on this trip, there were 5 of us, so each of us had a 4-hour watch. That would be time at the helm. On that first day, we crossed the Gulf Stream, where the ocean is a different color and it has a different weather on top. Later, my first watch was at night, and I got to see some stuff that struck me as magical. As I looked to the rear in our wake, I saw all these luminous beings, and they were jellyfish and plankton that lit up as the boat passed through. It's called bioluminescence. It was really astounding there. And what else was astounding was the stars. I had never seen them so bright or so close. It seemed like I could reach out and touch them. I had the feeling that perchance our nautical explorers of the past had a similar feeling. So day 2, beautiful day, Norwegian cruise ship comes by and warns us of some rough weather several days ahead. Well, I paid no attention. Nobody else seemed to. The seas were calm, and we were heading straight to the Bermuda Triangle. What could go wrong, right? On day 3, the winds kicked up a little, the seas got a little rougher, but the breeze was strong and steady, and Jay said the boat was hitting its top speed of 9.5 knots, and we were making record time. On day 4, things changed drastically. Suddenly, the winds were blowing at 30 knots, and whitecaps kind of ruled the horizon. Noah's Ark was rocking. Wasn't the most comfortable thing in the world. Then the winds hit 40, and we had to reef the sails so that the gusts wouldn't capsize the boat. The seas got very big, and at the time I would be in a trough of a wave, and I'd look around 360 degrees, see nothing but water. The winds then hit 50 knots, sails went down, storm jibs went up, and we needed the diesel running full time to maintain our course. Then as night fell, it was time for the crew to get tethered to the boat so as not to be washed into the raging seas. And the wind is howling, and these huge waves, 30, 40 feet high, started crashing over the boat, putting us underwater 30 seconds or more at a time. I was scared. I was Hail Mary scared. I was Our Father scared. I was scared. Then I started looking around, raging seas, and what I saw were millions of these luminous beings lighting up everything all over the place. It was surreal. Everywhere I looked, it looked like Van Gogh's Starry Night painting. And that fear, which I don't think was helping me survive, was gone. Day 5 hits, and we're still in the middle of the storm. The boat had rocked so much, we got water in the diesel fuel, and it killed the engine, which we needed to stay on course. But Jay is diesel mechanic, so he could get it going again with some fuel. So I'm at the helm. Ralph says to Marty, hold up the lid of the lazarette here while I reach in and get some fuel. So Marty's holding the lid, bracing himself. Ralph reaches in for the fuel. Just then, huge wave hits the side of the boat. Marty drops the lid right on Ralph's head. And I'm thinking, ooh, Ralph's going to have some words for Marty. Instead, Ralph calmly says, come on, Marty, just hold it up. We got to get the fuel out. So Marty's holding the lid up again. Ralph reaches in again. Another wave hits the boat. The lid slams Ralph in the head again. Now I'm thinking, Ralph is going to deck him this time. But Ralph stays really calm. Says, we can get this done, Marty. Just hold it open. Third time was a charm. Ralph got the fuel out, gave it to Jay. Jay got the motor going. We stayed on course, and everything was copacetic. Day 6, the weather had passed. We made landfall at the customs dock at St. George, Bermuda. I got out, started kissing the ground, only to find that everything was still rocking like I was out at sea. I couldn't even pass the driving test to rent a scooter, which is the only way you can get around in Bermuda. So that night, the crew hit the Swizzle Inn. We all got rip-roaring drunk and terrorized the other patrons with our attempts at karaoke. On the way back to Noah's Ark, I had to crawl on my hands and knees on the plank so as not to fall in the harbor. Next day, I flew home, hungover, but with thoughts of adventure in my head. 2 weeks later, Jay Brennan threw a barbecue for the crew at his home at Manitou on the Hudson, and we kind of did a post-mortem of the trip. And I got a hold of Ralph, and I said, Ralph, what was going on with you and Marty there? He kept dropping the lid of the lazarette on your head, and the second time he did it, I thought for sure you were going to deck him. And he's like, Bruce, think about it. We're out in a very dangerous situation. We're in the middle of a hurricane. At any moment, any one of us might have to depend on the other to save our life. He says, I did not want to give Marty any reason to hesitate whatsoever if he had to save mine. So I thank Ralph for the wisdom. I thank Noah for the ark. I thank Marty for the drama. And I thank Jay Brennan for the adventure.
You know, it's really an amazing thing, but you see your storytellers getting better and better. So our next storyteller is Maureen Morrissey. She retired from 37 years as a teacher and picked up her pen and her suitcase. She has written 2 novels. She's working on another one, and she's traveled extensively. The story she's going to tell us is about a recent trip that turned out to be an emotional journey as well. Maureen.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out. This past February, I went with some friends on a trip to Indonesia. It was the first time that I had ever crossed the international date line, and it was pretty mind-blowing because I lost a day of my life on the journey out. We left on a Thursday, flew 18 hours, and got there in time for Saturday morning breakfast. So it was mind-blowing to think that we had traveled to the other side of the planet. But there was another reason that this trip was mind-blowing for me. It was the first time that anyone in my family had set foot in Indonesia since 1945. My father's family had fled the Netherlands and Belgium when the Nazis invaded, and they traveled to what was then the Dutch East Indies to wait out the war. But after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese came in and imprisoned all of the Europeans in Indonesia. 30,000 Europeans died in those camps over 4 years that they were there, including my grandfather. My father and his mother and his sister were among the only survivors of our family. So I grew up hearing his horror stories, and I honestly had a little trepidation about going back to the country that was the setting for this part of my family history. When we arrived in Indonesia, we were met by our driver and our guide, who would spend the next week with us showing us his country. And in spite of the trepidation, I didn't know what he knew about the part of his country's history that would have affected my family. And so I kind of set it aside because I wanted to not color our week together. So I set aside my concerns and I started to look around. The countryside was breathtaking. It was green, verdant, hot, humid. The streets were just loaded with mopeds and cars. The sidewalks were filled with people and just hundreds of dogs running around. The air was fragrant, and it was just beautiful. So Dewar took us to our hotel to drop off our things and begin our adventures. One of the first places that he took us to was a temple that was 1,000 years old. I put my hand on the wall of the temple and I could feel the energy of 1,000 years of history going up my arm, and it was breathtaking. At the temple, they performed a lion dance, a traditional lion dance where two men get inside the costume. It's a huge lion costume, and they perform this dance accompanied by very exotic music played by xylophones and gongs. And it was just a wonderful experience to see this story of Indonesian history. He then took us to a monkey preserve. And I'm not really sure why they needed a preserve because there are monkeys everywhere. But it was a lot of fun because you actually got close to them. They were used to the people in this preserve, and it was just beautiful. He took us to a sunset fire dance, and this involved another ancient traditional story that involved rulers and their women and all kinds of stories, but it also involved throwing large quantities of fire all over the place. So it was a little bit scary, but in the end, we were safe, so we enjoyed that very much. We also went to see woodworking shops, silversmiths, very high-end jewelry stores. In the silversmiths, one of my friends bought her daughter a marble and silver shot glass. And she bought for her son a silver sword that was mounted as a piece of art. These were not the things I was interested in purchasing myself as souvenirs. What I wanted to do was to go to a spice farm. I had grown up on Indonesian food, and so I was looking forward to filling the duffel bag that I had brought in my suitcase with spices to take back and cook with and give to my children. The spice farm, they also grew cocoa and chocolate. So when you walk into the spice farm, you sit down at a picnic table, and the woman brings you basically a flight, like a beer flight, but it has chocolate, coffee, and tea on it, and everything is labeled so that you'll know what you're tasting and you'll know what you might want to purchase. So I recognized the labels of everything except one, so I asked the woman, what is kopi luwak? And she said kopi means coffee, and luwak is the weasel that is native to Indonesia. And she proceeded to explain that they feed the coffee beans to the weasels, who then process said coffee beans and return them to the farmer just the way you would imagine. It's then put through a process and it's roasted, and then voila, they serve you kopi luwak. I couldn't bring myself to taste it, but I did get some for each of my kids, and they actually were thrilled. So my friend bought her daughter a $60 shot glass, and my kids each got a pound of poop coffee. But everybody seemed very satisfied. I did ask my daughter later, what would you do with a $60 shot glass anyway? And she said, shots? So I guess so. The biggest highlight of our trip, though, was a sunrise hike up Mount Batur, which is an active volcano. We started the hike in the pitch black night. It was a treacherous hike. It was vertical, it was rocky, it was muddy, and we could not see a thing, although there were stars out, we were underneath the trees. When we got to the top of the mountain, our guide had us sit on a ridge, and he brought us a cup of coffee, told us where to sit. And as the sun began to, it was getting lighter, the sky was getting lighter, we could see that we were in an area just surrounded by steaming volcanoes, and there was a reflective lake in the middle. It was like something out of a photograph, out of your imagination. It was hard to even understand how it felt to be there that day. There were about 100 of us along the ridge of the volcanoes watching this happen. And once the sun began to come up and it was really showing its colors, even the dogs who had joined our trek seemed to be sitting and facing east. It was silent on the ridge as the sun started to come up. It was a level of reverence I had never felt before. So as we sat there just gazing east, the guides all came back and they brought us breakfast. They had steamed eggs on the volcanic steam and served it to us. And I have to say that I've never had anything that tasted quite that good. So we stayed until the sun came up, and we wanted to get back down before it got too hot. But before we left the volcano, he took me to stand in a steam vent so that I could feel the power of it and also have one more thing to brag about. So the trip to Indonesia, when we were packing up to leave after an amazing week, a wonderful week full of experiences, I was trying to figure out how I felt about being back in Indonesia. I did not ever bring it up to the guide because I knew he wanted to learn as much about America from us as we wanted to learn about Indonesia from him. And I wanted to make it comfortable for everyone. So my little group kept my not so little secret the whole time that we were there. But I did have some thoughts about how I felt about the trip. In one way, I felt vindicated, a little bit vindicated, coming back to Indonesia as an American tourist after what had happened to my family. In another way, I felt some closure, too, because it was a part of our family history that had been kind of lying open all of our lives. And we've been back for now 2 months, and I've had some time to reflect on it. And one of the things I realized is that the Indonesia of my father's life was an absolutely unimaginable nightmare. But the Indonesia that I had just experienced was a bit of a dream. Thank you.
By the way, a couple of Maureen's books will be on sale in the outer room during intermission, and I know one of them at least addresses her family history, and I'm going to be grabbing one of those, so you'll have an opportunity to check in with Maureen and her books just during intermission. It's very interesting that Michael Feinestein is also the child of Holocaust survivors, but his story sheds light on the experience of immigrant children trying to find their way into American life. Michael.
Thank you. I'd read a book a little while ago talking about the refugees in 1945, which is when World War II ended. There were thousands of refugees throughout Europe, and they were collected in displaced persons camps in various countries. I was born in one of them in November of 1949 in Germany. I decided to actually do a little bit of research in reading this and went online to put down the name of the camp, which was Waldstadt, Poking, Germany. And I came up with a file, Yad Vashem, which collects memorabilia from survivors, and opened up this file. And in this file, there were pictures of this camp. And as I perused the pictures, I noticed people, of course, that were in costumes or clothes of that period. And I noticed one picture that had a collection of refugees that had a poster that said, translation was, do not send us to Cyprus. They were planning on closing down this camp and sending it to Cyprus with all of these refugees, which is a small island, Eastern Mediterranean, which would have been awful. What I noticed after a while, looking closely, was that the very front of this was my mother. A picture of my mother when she was in her early 20s, Slavic features, dark hair, very focused eyes. She looked like a woman that you could be reckoned with. And fortunately, this camp was not closed. She did meet her husband there, and I was born. And fortunately, my father actually got a visa from an uncle, to one of the few visas that were issued at that time, to come to America, and got an apartment in Brooklyn. We had a 2-week journey across the Atlantic Ocean. My parents were very distraught, being Polish Jewish survivors from the Holocaust in Europe, and I was very sick. I hadn't really had any prenatal care, and needless to say, food was very scarce there. When we came here, my parents were very loving and diligent to try to keep me alive. I had encephalitis, rheumatic fever, all sorts of illnesses, and through all the visits that my mother took me to, I felt more comfortable in the doctor's waiting room than any place else that we had. Over time, I actually did manage to recover, and my father decided he would teach me what he thought was one very important thing for immigrants, which was numbers. And he sat down and played dominoes with me regularly. I don't even know how to play dominoes now, and he won just about every game, but was ingrained in me with all the numerics and how the patterns of the numbers were. And that was really the beginning of my learning a mathematical language. My uncle would come over and actually even give me tests in multiplication tables, and if I got good scores on them, he would actually give me a treat. The language that I learned at home was Yiddish. Yiddish was the only language I spoke. I didn't read it, and it actually prevented me from really becoming close with people in the community. Kids, of course, were Native Americans, And I spent a lot of time playing alone with toys in the hall or building model airplanes, and started to learn some of the language by watching television. And I watched shows like Captain Kangaroo, or once there was a show with an artist called John Nagy, where he would actually draw, and you were supposed to have a special screen that went on your television set to prevent yourself from drawing on the screen, but I would actually draw right on the TV the very items he had, much to the disappointment of my parents, but they put up with it. And my mother actually took me to some of the movies that she enjoyed seeing. She took me to see the Ten Commandments, and at that time, these movies made such an impression on me. I thought Charlton Heston was really Moses, and these were the real Jews that were being parted in the Red Sea. My parents decided to visit a cousin we had in the Lower East Side, and they wanted to take me along. But I was really quite frightened being taken on subways. The doors just clammed shut, and I had the feeling that I would be shut out on the outside of the train, and my parents would be on the inside, and I'd never get to see them again. When I actually did take a trip, we got to the Lower East Side, and as we were walking towards my cousin, a little boy came over to me with a sword that he was brandishing, speaking some language I didn't know, and I thought he was about to stab me. And my mother just laughed and talked to him, and jokingly, she told me he just wanted to play with you. He was speaking Polish. Needless to say, this was not going to encourage me to take trips to the Lower East Side. My parents decided to put me in what was the cheapest kind of babysitting that was available at the time, which was a matinee movie theater in the neighborhood. And they used to have a section where a matron would watch over you, and I would be put there for basically the entire trip, which was 2 movies. And the movies were uncurated, so I would see movies like World War II movies called Attack with Jack Palance, and his arm was completely flattened by a tank, and he was bleeding, making his way down the street. I watched Babyface Nelson with James Cagney, who was mowing down everybody, and I couldn't wait to get home to get a toy machine gun because it seemed like so much fun. As time went on, there was a need for me to go to school, and my parents were traditionally Orthodox, and they decided they would send me to a yeshiva. And there was a need to have me evaluated. And the evaluation came back to my mother, and it said, your son has severe disabilities, and we can't really teach him here in this school. My mother went up to school to explore what had happened, and apparently the evaluator that was evaluating me didn't completely realize I only knew Yiddish, and they didn't know Yiddish very well, and I knew just a smattering of English. So after some discussion, they agreed that I would go to the school and they would accept me while I was there. But it was a very difficult process for me because I was really learning 2 languages that started from different directions. English started from left to right, Hebrew was from right to left, and Hebrew was, as you may know, a language going back hundreds of years that had an arcane way of expressing itself. As time went on, I just really couldn't keep up with the group, and the principal called my mother again, and he told her, I'm sorry, but we have to expel your son. He's not able to keep up. And my mother was bereft. She was in tears. I was stunned being there. And when we came home, she spoke with my father, and she really took the alternative that she never really wanted to do, which was to send me to public school in the 5th grade. And I started the public school that year. It was PS 215 in Brooklyn, and I thought that was terrific. I had a teacher that went with my mother and told her, you've got to speak English at home, not Yiddish. Your son has got to learn how to speak English fluently. They sent my mother to a library to get a library card, and picked out some books. And my mother, who couldn't really afford a tutor at the time, told me, I need you to read for a half hour every day, and I'll sit beside you while you do that. And that's what I did. And while she sat there, I did read, but as soon as she fell asleep, I went back to playing with my toys. And I thought that was just great. But I did learn to love to read some of the stories I read, which had some funny scenes. I started to read comic books, and that was really my introduction to English. The teacher actually had us learn how to play a little tonette, and I learned how to play Go Tell Aunt Rudy the Old Grey Goose is Dead, which I thought was terrific. Well, they gave us science experiments to do, and that was just great. Our household was getting bigger, and my father decided we were going to move, and he bought a house in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, and I thought that was great. It was a nice-sized house. I had my own bedroom, but they decided they were going to send me back to a local yeshiva. I went to this yeshiva, and it was hard to believe, but this was going to be more oppressive than the previous one. It was all male. You only learned Hebrew from 7 o'clock in the morning till 1 in the afternoon, and then you had some elderly gentlemen do a smattering of English. And I found that this was, I found it very difficult to continue with both languages. I wound up falling behind in Hebrew, and would try to distract myself by doing anything I could. At one point, I was poking the kid next to me. He poked me, and I poked him harder, and I saw he was going to give me an elbow right in the side, and I moved over, and he hit his elbow right into the metal frame, gave out a howl, and the rabbi was livid. Because, number one, I just started laughing. In fact, every time I looked at this kid, I was laughing that this was going on. The rabbi came over to me, he asked me to stand up, and then I could see he was taking his hand back and he was going to give me a slap. I took a step back and he completely spun around. The class cracked up, and I knew we were really in trouble then, and he asked us to get up. We went to the principal's office. He had us sit down. He's probably communicated what happened to the principal. The principal came out, and I knew we were going to get ready for some big lecture or something. He asked us to stand up, which we did, and then without saying anything, he took both hands, slapped us across the sides of the face, said, "Go back to the room. Don't ever do that again." Needless to say, this was not going to be a great experience for me. But I tried my best to stay with the English program while I was falling behind in the Hebrew, and lo and behold, the principal called my mother in again when it was time to go to the 8th grade, and he told her, "I'm starting a high school here, and I believe your son should continue in our high school." And he tried to convince her by saying, if I went anywhere else, I would lose the faith and be something less than Jewish. And when we left, I had a conversation with my mother, and I told her, I just can't continue in this school. At that point, I had some friends who were sectarian or even Catholic or Protestants in the neighborhood. I was feeling I was becoming more of the local culture, and I told her, if you make me go to school here, I won't go to school anywhere. And fortunately, she relented, and I actually wound up going to Abraham Lincoln High School, a school of 2,000 people, which was a regular high school that gave me everything that I needed to actually start a career and move forward in the culture. This past Mother's Day, I was able to visit my mother, and I was very thankful that this woman, who's now 101, made the right decision. Thank you.
I think about all the immigrants that come to our country, and each one of them has a story. So our next story is from Paul Heery. And Paul has had a lifetime of a loving marriage and challenging career, demanding career. But life has its way of flipping switches on us and closing one door and opening another, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. Fortunately for us, one of the doors that Paul has opened is becoming a great storyteller. Paul?
Thank you. Last year, I found myself back on the dating scene after a 44-year hiatus. It may just be me, but I think things changed a little bit since I was in my 20s. Let me explain how I got to start this new journey in my life. Last year, my wife, Andy, passed away after we were dealing with her stage 4 cancer for about 6 years. Andy had always taken great care of me, and she felt the need to take care of me after she was gone as well. She gave me 4 rules to live by after she was gone. She actually gave me 3 rules first, and rule number 4 came much later. Rules 1 through 3 were actually pretty simple to adhere to. Rule number 1 was to stop working so hard. So I retired. Rules 2 and 3 went together hand in hand. They were go out and meet new people and have fun. Over the past year, I've done a lot of traveling, and as Marcia mentioned, I've also found a new love in storytelling. Over the past year, I've been at over 30 storytelling events, and one day I hope to get good at it. Rule number 4 has proven to be a bit more problematic to satisfy. When Andy's health was in decline, and we both knew that it wasn't going to be much longer, one day she came to me, and I knew that she had something to say. She said, "The luckiest day of my life was the day that I met you. And after I'm gone, I want you to find somebody else and make them lucky too." Being a smartass, I responded, "Does that mean I'm allowed to get lucky?" She immediately responded, "That's exactly what I mean, you blockhead." After that, we shared a good laugh, and then Andy came over to me, kissed me gently, leaned over, whispered in my ear with some further direction. She said, "Get fucked." Now, that story I told at a bereavement support group about 2 months after Andy passed. People reacted differently. There was some shock in the room, some disdain, but on the faces of some of the men in the room, I felt they were a little jealous of me. So that put me out onto a new path. After that bereavement meeting was over, one of the other members of the group came up to me and gave me a subscription to an online dating site. So I took some time, pulled together a profile, which I thought was pretty good, and it was pretty quick that I started getting people liking me. Now, I had been warned about all the scams and the bots that have to do with online dating. So I was fairly well prepared. And one day I got liked by a woman, and I checked out her profile, and it looked to be a good match. Her profile said that she was the same age as I was at the time, 64. She was single, and the profile pictures that she had, she was extremely attractive. So I liked her back, and we started exchanging messages through the app for a while. And eventually, I got to a point where it was like, okay, I need to find out a little bit more about this woman and to verify some things. What I really wanted to do is speak to her so I could determine that her name was not actually Dimitri. So we got on the phone. I actually taught her how to block her outgoing caller ID so she could call me, protect her own privacy. She called me almost immediately, and we went back and forth, had a great conversation, and we agreed that we would meet in 2 days to have some coffee. But during that first phone call, she said that she had Googled me and really didn't find anything out about me. So there's something that I learned, that when you're dating online, you have to go out and stalk people online to find out about them before actually meeting them. So she said she couldn't find anything about me, but she also said that she was very protective of her personas, online persona as well, and challenged me to find out some more about her. I said, okay, great. Now, one thing I haven't shared with you to this point is during my career, I was heavily involved with cybersecurity. So I learned a few tricks along the way and actually had some friends who taught me a few things. And it took me about 10 minutes to find out a few things about her. 2 days later, we meet. And going in, I had all the information that I needed to know. In walked this woman who was absolutely gorgeous, a complete knockout. And she looked really good for someone who was 76 years old. 12 years older than her online profile. I also found about her husband and how long they had been married. So I really wanted to know what else she was going to lie about. She fessed up to everything and told me that she had had an open marriage for years. She was actually married, and she also had a sexual addiction. So on the surface, you're thinking, okay, you may get lucky. But I came to the conclusion that I was looking for something more than that. I really needed more of an emotional connection. Andy had wrapped herself around my heart and had not let go at that point. So it's something that I needed to pass on with that. Shortly thereafter, I gave up on online dating. So rule number 4 has not yet been completely satisfied. It's still on my to-do list, and I'm open to any suggestions. Thank you.
So we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back after intermission with 4 more stories. Please go out and enjoy some of the wonderful baked goods and have fun for a while. We'll be back.